that we're talking about stretch goals, things we may not be able to achieve. And when you're talking about business models, there's always going to be an unknown. But that's okay, because there's really two ways that we can win. One is creating the tangible value, one is creating the intangible value. Now, when we talk about innovation, I want to talk, a lot of times people think of innovation, especially with the popular magazines, the most innovative companies, it's all product innovation. But instead, I'd like to talk about 5 different domains of innovation. And by the way, at the end, I'll give you my email address, or you can give me a card. I'll send you the keystone slides for this presentation. Not every single one, because there's some redundancies, but if you want, I'll be happy to send the main ones to you. So I'll give you that at the end. They'll save your handwriting if you want. But you see, there's 5 different domains of innovation. The first is I call top line, which really is what are the kinds of innovations that are aimed at optimizing the revenues. Now that can be marketing, advertising, technology development, whatever kind of revenue generating innovations you have. Midline innovations refer again to your balance sheet. What are the innovations that are aimed at cost efficiency, reducing costs, making things more productive, improving quality, et cetera, process innovations. The third domain is what I would call knowledge or talent innovations. What are the innovations around how you recruit, how you develop people, how you manage knowledge, the whole knowledge management systems? What are innovations around the gaining of intellectual capital overall? Then I call organizational innovations. These are innovations aimed at organization-wide impact. It includes business models. It includes organizational design, organizational culture. It includes things like your budget planning systems and so on. How do you innovate those? I'll tell you a quick story. I was working once with Northern Telecom in Canada, and all their comptrollers had come to me and said, you know, we are the naysayers. That's our reputation. We are the ones who say no to innovation. How can we become known as the facilitators of innovation? And we spent about 2 days together really doing some creative work around that. And again, as the postman, it wasn't my idea, but the real breakthrough came when someone said, you know, our job is the scorekeeper. That's really what our job is the controllers. We keep score. But what we can also do is change the scorecard. With the invention of activity-based costing, that was a revolution in costing measures. We can change the scorecard to actually value increasing customer loyalty. How do you value those kinds of intangibles? So it's that way of starting to think about innovation at the organizational level. The fifth is I call stakeholder innovations. These are the innovations about how do you relate to all the external stakeholders, if you will, the environment, society, academics, your customers, your vendors. Again, I remember working with one company, and their focus was how can the purchasing department play a role in corporate innovation? And the key to it was the fact that the purchasing department is so in touch with the vendors that they know better than the R&D people what these other vendors are actually cooking up. And how do you make that bridge of connection so that the R&D department is not having to reinvent the wheel? So those kinds of innovations, what we're talking about today is specifically business model innovation, but it fits into a much larger scheme of things. Okay? Now, I'd like to start with you with a question. What are some examples of what you would call business model innovation that you've actually experienced, and what can we learn from those? What's the kind of knowledge or experience that you've had? Yes.
A while ago, Netflix?
Netflix?
They disrupted Blockbuster, Hollywood, and all this.
Mm-hmm. Okay, they disrupted. How did they disrupt it? What was the business model innovation?
I think the delivery model was on demand rather than going and renting from the store.
Mm-hmm. Okay, the delivery model, the process of reaching the customer. What's another example from somebody? Yes?
Yeah, read about eBay.
Yes?
Currently, John Donahue is trying to reinvent the business model.
Mm-hmm.
We think of eBay has always been an auction site.
Mm-hmm.
Now he's reinventing the business model to be the technology arm for all retailers to protect against Amazon's invasion. So from being just an auction site, now we looked at, take this technology and offer it to all the retailers, they can reach new customers.
Now, what can we learn from that? What's the lesson that we can draw from that example? Do you have an idea?
I think the core value proposition, it's all about thinking, the core is still the same. It's an adjacency for land. But you're looking at the same value proposition from the offering of your community, but you're leveraging your audience and offering other channels to other.
So you're changing your point of view of the constituency of the stakeholders and seeing yourself from a different angle. That's a very important lesson.
Yeah.
Other one over here?
Subscription-based model.
What's that?
Subscription-based model.
Subscription-based
like,
model.
which is typically used in the gaming industry. So like, it's kind of pay as you go. How much you're using, only you pay for those services.
You're not buying the software, you're just buying the subscription.
Yes.
Okay, just a second, you have one?
How about the Steve Jobs smartphone, which created a revolution in the heart of the people? Isn't it the innovation coming out from Steve Jobs which changed the world?
Well, the question is, there was the technology, but what was the business model that went with the technology?
App Store.
The App Store. You see, he created an ecology, not just a technology.
Yeah.
That's where the business model comes in. The same thing happened with the PC, by the way. It was the business model behind the PC, not the PC technology itself, which had been around for 5 or 10 years. Yes.
Actually, the example I'll give from Apple, all the things are well known, but it's the getting back to the store. So when Steve says, I want to start stores, the board says, we are not in the brick and mortar business. He says, no, it's glass and steel. See, that thing nobody thought, I mean, they were all losing money, but getting into the retail and the stores, I mean, the New York store has more business than all stores combined.
Good,
That's a disruptive business model.
good, yes, yes. You had one?
Advertising based business model where you give the product or service free and make money through advertising.
Okay, so, which in a certain way is a modification of the NBC, ABC, CBS business model, which is you offer free TV and advertisers pay. But, so we've recycled it in a certain way, yes.
The freemium model where you give the base free and then add-ons are at charge.
Okay, good.
EDR from Kindle.
Okay, yes, one more.
I would say online education, the fact that now you can watch videos on Khan Academy and learn, as opposed to going to school.
Right, okay, so again, a whole different delivery business model. I'll talk about with Coursera in a few moments as an example of that. Now the question is, what difference does this make for you? I mean, we can talk about that at a very high level, C-floor executives, they all get, turned on about this, but we've got everyone sitting in this room. Why is business model innovation something that you showed up for tonight?
Consumers benefit out of it at the end of the day.
Okay,
It makes technology or things that are expensive, cheaper or available to them, and access of information changes to this.
and that you want to know more about how to do that. Good, and how to amplify that, good.
How do you compete in the global economy where the competition is intense, so many very firm, you need to be innovative. You have some good business models where you can compete and succeed.
Okay, so the issue of competing and succeeding in a very complex way. There's before I come back, there's a wonderful study by IBM. It came out in 2010 called Capitalizing on Complexity. Really recommend it. You can find it at the IBM site, so you can just Google it. It interviewed 1,500 executives, chairman of the board, managing directors, and so on, public, private sector, and said, what is the biggest challenge that you're facing in managing your enterprises? And the crux of their finding was that it's the complexity, the increasing complexity of the global business realm. And then they asked, what are the qualities of a leader that are necessary to guide your enterprises through this complexity time? And they came up with 3. By far and away, 60% of the people selected creativity and innovation as a quality of leadership, as the #1 item. The second was integrity, ethics, integrity, character. The third was global thinking, holistic perspectives, systems perspectives. We will talk about those as themes tonight, because those are the fundamental themes of value-centered innovation itself. But that where creativity, integrity, global thinking are fundamental to any business model and leading any business model itself. Yes?
Bill, you just say why we are here, that means. My comment is for last 40 years, Silicon Valley was the darling of the world for innovation. Last 10 years, that darling title is slipping away from us. So we want to go back on it, and that's what I am here to see. How can we do that?
Okay, good, thank you. Anybody else in terms of what has brought you here? Why is this important for you? Yes?
Yeah, so one thing you can observe is a lot of new companies, especially in the emerging markets, they are coming up with new innovative business models, and that could be a big threat to established players in different segments.
Could be a big threat and a big opportunity. We'll see which.
Yeah.
Okay. Good. Okay. Now, what I'm going to do this evening is take you through, I call it a 4448 process of business model innovation. There are different, this way, everyone who invents a business model goes through this process consciously or unconsciously. And I'm trying to help make it more conscious. The first is, when we talk about the theme, what are you up to? The first is, what is your fundamental understanding of the purpose and nature of business itself? And there are 4 different paradigms that are coexisting today in the business world, and I'll talk about those later tonight. But they're very, very different, and yet they build on each other. But which one is the driving force for your business model? The second is, from the India culture, there are 4 fundamental goals of life. How do you incorporate those goals of life into your strategic thinking, into your business model, and what is actually missing today in most business thinking? The third is, how do you think innovatively? Now, this goes back to work that I started back at SRI in 1986-87. But there are 4 very distinctly different strategies of thinking innovatively that we can measure, we can give individual profiles, but each one of them will come up with a different kind of solution when you're trying to think strategically. So we'll talk about those. And finally, there's 8 different factors of the business model itself, at least as I would see it. There's different ways of slicing that pie. You know, you can look at business model like a territory. Now, you can have geographical maps, road maps, weather maps. There are different maps depending on what you're looking for. This in particular is the map I have on this territory called business models. There are other maps that have other uses and things like that. So this is not the model, but it's one that I find very useful to think about. And in fact, I'm going to start with that because that's the nitty-gritty of understanding a business model itself. And then about halfway through, I'm going to come back out to the larger view of things. So with business models, I looked at the 8 factors as these. The first is principles. What is the purpose and values that shape the model? By values, especially the qualities of integrity and good character. What is actually shaping the model from that point of view? People. What's the relationship with the various stakeholders? What are the products and services that are offered? What are the systems and practices by which work gets done or that by which you reach out and share what you're doing? Planet. What are the means of sustaining the Earth's resources? How is that a part of your business model? 6 is partners. Who are the allied people or organizations who actually enable the model with you? Part of your ecosystem, if you will. Prosperity. What is the flow of benefits and well-being? A lot of times we talk about what's the financial model, but I'm trying to talk about a little bit bigger there. And finally, what's the proposition? What is, we call a value proposition, what's the promise that's actually made? And that when you look at those, typically 1 or 2 or maybe 3 are going to drive the nature of the business model itself. And I want to give you 8 examples of business models from different companies around the world that have reshaped in some way their industry. And how each of the examples has a different driver I want to highlight. So the first one is Charles Schwab. As you may know, back in the 1970s, he started the Charles Schwab Company. But it was based, first of all, on his insight that there, to him, was an inherent conflict of interest of most brokerage houses. And the conflict of interest went like this. We have analysts who make recommendations. We have brokers who earn money on commission. They make money when their customers either buy or sell. And we use these recommendations to encourage them to buy or sell based on our recommendations. But what happens if you have a customer and buying and selling is not in their best interest? Then you as a broker don't make money. And he said this is part of the root of some of the lack of integrity that Wall Street was known for. So he said, let me figure out a different business model. So what he did, he said, first of all, we'll have no analysts. We're going to go for people who already know what they want. We're not going to give advice. And we're not going to pay brokers on commission, we're going to pay them on salary. So we'll simply transact what you want to have done. This got rid of the conflict of interest, but it also gave a reputation for him. And having had them as a client of mine, I know this personally, that it started attracting people from other brokerage houses who wanted to work for a more ethical company. And so when you look at their story, their principles drove it. High ethics, no conflict of interest, be trustworthy, let everyone be financially fit. They're going for people who know what to invest. Their product, for example, was like one source. They were the first one to go out to mutual funds to say, we will be your broker for mutual funds, if you will. We'll be a one source for our clients. One of the things they did, by the way, in that case, was that the mutual funds said, okay, we'll just create a different class of fund for the people who buy through you, and we'll simply charge them a higher management fee. And Schwab said, no. That's hidden. That's not upfront. That's not transparent. We will not do business with you. So he held to that transparency, even in negotiating things like that. The planet, reducing environmental impact of operations is one of their corporate goals. Partners were like mutual fund companies in this example. Salary rather than commission, discount prices. It promises will carry out your investment wishes with no advice, no conflict of interest. When it came to the time when customers started saying, it's too complex, give us advice, there became an internal debate. And the debate was hold true to our values. So they said, we'll educate, but we will not advise. So they evolved to an education rather than an advice-giving firm. Now the second one I want to point out is, imagine it's 1970, and you're a professor at a university in Bangladesh, and you're wondering, how can we extend financial services to the poorest of the poor, the people in the villages, and at the same time help spur employment and entrepreneurialism, even in the village men and women? This was the trek of Muhammad Yunus in starting the Grameen Bank with the government support. And really, their focus was extending banking to and creating employment opportunities for poor men and women. Their product was microfinancing, which I'm sure you're all aware of, but to the point that they now have 9 million borrowers, 97% of whom are women, because of the empowerment that they have found in many, many developing countries about the power of giving women that kind of boost. The process, the bank branches of rural groups, borrower groups that support and monitor their accountability, because see, there's no contracts, there's no collateral, there's simply accountability between you and your peers who are fellow borrowers. And their partners were government. 95% of the bank equity is actually owned by the borrowers. 5% by the Bangladesh government. A whole different prosperity model. The proposition will give you microcredit funding while you and your peers support each other to repay. And 97% is the repayment rate. Imagine if we had 97% repayment rate on our home mortgages these days. Just to put that in perspective. The third example I'd like to give is with Philips. Philips went to examine some of the needs of India. And they found that one of the issues that was going on in rural India was the kind of cooking stoves, the use of biofuels, the kind of pollution inside the homes, the breathing diseases that were being fostered, They said, can we make a product that can address that? And they did. They called it the Chula stove, which I'll show you in a second. It cuts emissions by 95%. There's 45% use of less biofuels. It costs in the range of roughly $30 to $50, which makes it affordable. And it's traditional design. It actually looks like this. This is the actual construction of it. Here's the actual new airflow. Here's what it looks like, and so on. And in addition to that invention, they wanted to co-create social innovations to make and actually distribute, so that they were fostering entrepreneurship for where they would actually make, produce, distribute, and care for that whole ecosystem of business. So it was an employment scheme, not just a product scheme, if you will. The prosperity was to uplift new opportunities for work, not just consumerism. They weren't just trying to sell more stuff. And they used local entrepreneurs for the manufacturing and distribution. The proposition will provide you with a much healthier, less costly stove and stimulate local jobs. Again, these are examples of business models that were shifting the way the default thinking of business would be. The next one I would like to talk about is Dell Computers. Now, we know the story of Michael Dell, made computers in his University of Texas dorm room, things like that. And he said, can I scale up this way of doing things? So that the process was that we would only make computers when they were pre-ordered. Now, by the way, Michael Dell had that vision, but very often we overestimate the heroism of the individual entrepreneur. You know, we put them up on the pedestals. Well, Michael Dell would not have made it without Mort Topfer. Mort Topfer was an executive from Motorola. He was 55 years old when Michael Dell was 30. He was the one who would come together to create the process and operational systems to scale up that way of doing business. Because one of the things that they needed to have was, the way they put it is that our inventory of parts needed to have the shelf life of lettuce. It's a nice image of how they had to operate very lean while they were building things. They also, of course, at the time had a brilliant financial model, which was they only built something that had already been paid for. You know, they didn't have inventory that was waiting to be sold at Best Buy or CompUSA or something like that. They weren't doing that. And so their process was computers built to customer specs, inventory shelf life of lettuce, partners such as Intel. The proposition will custom make your computer to your specs with greater technology and lower cost. That was the promise made. That's the value proposition, if you will. They also had a pun going on in their early days, which was to be direct. This was in the 90s. Not only were they selling direct, but they wanted a culture of honesty to each other. So how could we communicate as fellow employees directly? And be direct, not play games, not play politics, and so on. That tried to be their culture for a long time. The next one I want to focus on is Fuji Xerox. The executives at Fuji Xerox in Japan, around the year 2000, 2005, became very conscious of the use of materials and the use of the natural resources in making copiers. They said, what can we do about this? And what they started designing was a series of copiers, the DocuCenter series of copiers, in which 75% of the parts could be recycled into the next new copier without affecting performance. And that by doing so, they were able to cut the carbon emissions of manufacturing by 75%. And they could even design parts that would hit a third generation 60% of the time. But part of the business model with that type of technology was to, first of all, create the sensors that could monitor the use of those parts, so that, and then they had to create a business model of leasing and reclaiming all those copiers so that it was not ever wasted. They would reclaim them, get the parts back out, monitor that the sensors were accurate, use those parts again, and so on. So they basically created, what was driving it was to reduce resources in what they called infinite zero landfill. This was the driving force for the entire business model. This is what I'm trying to say, again, with all of these, certainly they had use and conserve natural resources wisely, design parts for reuse in the product. The process has centers for receiving, dismantling, and recycling these copiers. The promise will provide you with state-of-the-art copiers with 70% recycled parts and a full capture after use. That was the promise. But you can see where different parts of this model start driving the business model overall. The next one I'd like to talk about is Coursera. You were talking about that, I think, before, Nidhi. I think you were bringing it, of course. So Coursera, Udacity, huh? Udemy, yes. edX, I think is another one. So what they're trying to do is basically, in fact, they say it very well in Coursera, give millions of people, not just a few, access to world-class education.
I see.
With the people issues of empower people to improve their lives, their families' lives, and their communities by offering, with the right technology and the best professors, the ability to teach 100,000 people at a time. Now, it's interesting because I think, as someone was saying earlier, they're starting this without ever having figured out the revenue model, per se. And they're still learning that as they go along, like many ventures are still doing. What they're partly focusing on is that they can offer career services like LinkedIn, where they can start matching people who are taking courses with organizations who want to hire people. They can also start charging for certificates. They have just recently gotten the American ECE, American College Equivalency or something like that. It's basically an agency that gives equivalency credits so that you can take a course on Coursera, and any academic institution that accepted ACE credits, you can get those credits transferred. So, again, part of what they're doing, is the partnership that's driving it. Is the top academic institutions, the Stanford, the Harvard, the University of Chicago, places like that, which is the initial focus for Coursera with their courses. The next one I want to talk about for prosperity is that at Almond Dairy, those of you from India are very familiar with this brand. In 1946, up in the western part of India, the farmers who raised cows and had the dairy had a great deal of exploitation from the middlemen in terms of what the price they could buy, they could sell their milk to, where it got distributed to, and so on. They decided to come together and form a co-op. And that co-op is now 3 million farmers who own the co-op. It's basically what is it, $2 billion? This is not like a small co-op anymore. Let me put it this way. And what they have focused on is the co-op venture for maturing, processing, and marketing dairy. They still do a lot of ecological work together. The fact that they own it and their elected reps manage the societies and the co-op unions as they're structured, and yet some of the farmers only produce 1 to 2 quarts of milk a day. This is the scale at which they've been able to organize and operate this to be the largest dairy, largest co-op, certainly in India. Again, different kind of business model that changes the nature of an industry. Finally, on proposition, I'd like to talk about Facebook. Someone said it very smartly one time. They said, where else can you ask people? So many websites are based on their content, right? You go there because of the content.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Where else could you say, I want all of you to give me your content so I can make money from your content. But I'll give you the platform. But that's essentially, if you want to be cynical about it, that's what Facebook has done. What, in a certain way, their principle is to make the world more open and connected. And will enable you with an online place to stay connected for free in a more open world. That's essentially the integrity of what they're trying to do. How they do that financially, we all have our opinions of and so on. But essentially, that's where the business model starts from. People can stay connected, sharing what matters to them, certainly the way they're doing their software design centers and so on can have an environmental impact. There's a lot of other things that they can be doing while they're doing this at the same time in part of their business model. So with those 8, let me just stop there. Any comments or questions as you look at this model? Yes?
How does the 9P fits this model?
What's the 9P?
9P is profitability.
Profitability? That is what I would call the prosperity model. That's financial profitability, that's all under what I would call prosperity. So that prosperity to me is financial, it could be health, it could be education, it could be all the different measures that we have for what it means to be prosperous, of which financial is one part. This is my opinion, that's how I would think.
None of those companies would be successful unless they have the profitability financial model successful. So
Absolutely.
it's kind of a basement or concrete.
You know,
So
there's a great, I forget his name right now, but he was the head of one of the advertising agencies in the UK. And he said it beautifully. He says, we breathe in order to live. But do we live just in order to breathe? We do business in order to make money. But is money the only reason that we're doing business? That's the larger process, and as I'm getting into the next part, it'll put this also into another perspective, I think. Because what we're getting to, it's wonderful that you bring up this question, is what is the paradigm of what is business all about? And how do different people have different understandings of what that paradigm, where is the importance of finances in your model of what business is about? And there's 4 different ways that people think about that. So let me come back to that a second.
okay.
But certainly profitability is essential to have a business that grows, that creates employment. It's actually, it's the air, it's the circulation of value that allows you to be alive as a business. So there's nothing absolutely negative about it. It's just putting it in proper
There is
context.
another point of view of
Yeah.
what the business model is.
Yeah.
The business model is how do we make money?
So,
Because if we do have money, then
Mhm.
we can do all other P's easily.
yeah.
If we don't have money, we cannot really do anything.
And so let me come back to that with the 4 contexts also, okay? Yes?
Thank you for giving a lot of good examples here, but I like your comments on the 2 successful company of America. One I will pick up the old GE, General Electric. Other I will pick up Google. You have any comments why they are so big in making money? GE and Google. One is old, one is new.
Why is it that they're so successful in making money?
Yeah, for 100 years, GE and Google 20 years.
Well, the simplest answer, the default answer, is that they're serving people's needs with a value people are willing to pay for.
For 100 years, GE doing that.
That's right. Okay? They're serving people in a way that people are willing to pay for what the value they're getting. Okay? Now, the business model that they operate by is more than just money making. There's a lot of stuff to it. And we're starting to hold companies more and more accountable for other aspects of how they serve society and what their role in society is. I was talking once with a man named J.J. Irani. He was the former managing director of Tata Steel. And he put it this way, he says, in a sustainable way, you cannot be an island of prosperity in a sea of poverty. You cannot, it's not sustainable. You cannot only absorb benefits from the society and not be giving something back. You basically stop the circulation flow when you do. So this is where, again, when I'm coming to the next piece, I'll show you some more. One more, yes.
So I think this is a great way of slicing the various attributes of innovation. And I think there's one more P in my books, and that kind of underlies all this as a hallmark of innovation and leaders, and that's perseverance.
Good.
Because I think innovation is not such a neat straight line. It's fraught with failures, right? And you have this tipping point kind of phenomenon. If you give up before you get to that point, you're not going to be as successful. And so I think perseverance is a underlying attribute across all of these things.
Good. I'll tell you one little confession here. I started out with 6 Ps, I grew it to 8, now we have 10. The letter P and the letter C in the English language is unlimited. So you can grow your own map here, if you will.
In fact, his point is so valid. If you look the Thomas Edison's,
Yeah.
that is the P
Yeah,
he
10,000
emphasized.
failures before he got
Yeah,
there.
Thomas Edison.
Okay, now, what I'd like to do is move out of this area of just the 8 factors of the business model, up to these paradigms of the nature of business, the goals of business, the innovative thinking, and then how that comes back to innovating your business model. It starts with, and this is some research that we started in about the year 2002, to look at 4 different contexts or paradigms of how we think about business. The first grew starting around the year 1900, maybe 1880, 1920. The more rationalist would say the purpose of business is to generate wealth for the owners and the shareholders. Frederick Taylor was the management guru, scientific management. They talked about behavioral, B.F. Skinner kind of psychology. The idea of an organization was like a machine, and each one of us played a role, and when someone left, you found someone who fit into that particular role. And so it was like, a little bit like a machine dynamic, if you will. This is a context that we still have a lot going on, certainly, and yet there's been some others that have grown out of it. Starting in the 1950s, with McGregor, Maslow, Rogers, and others, we started looking at a more humanistic context of business. It still had wealth and power and self-actualization for the owners, but it also included employees and shareholders. So that, for example, you started getting stock ownership, ESOPs. You started getting the idea of total quality, where you would have people being more involved in how they can self-actualize. You started talking about product champions, Gifford Pinchot talked about entrepreneurship. The total quality movement really helped mature this as a way of operating. The HP way talked about people want to do a good job, and if given the right environment, they will do so. That was very different than the rationalists that said you have to have reward systems, carrots and sticks, in order to motivate people to do their work. In the 1970s and 80s, we began to get into more of a holistic approach, where it's prosperity, including financial wealth, but with accountability to all stakeholders. This is what we're in the midst of a maturing stage. This is where you get corporate social responsibility. This is where you get systems thinking, you get green mentality for products. You get the idea that, again, we can't be an island of prosperity in a sea of poverty, because we are inextricably linked with our society, and that we have a responsibility for how we do things. Europe heads the way more than America in terms of, for example, companies being responsible to reclaim their products. The refrigerator never makes it to the dump. The refrigerator goes back to the manufacturer, because that's where the whole environmental sustainability reporting, triple bottom line, all of these are evidence of a different paradigm. Now, with each one of these, the reason they're nested is because it doesn't contradict the previous. You still have the rationalist sense of conservation of resources, the importance of generating financial wealth. But the context is larger in terms of that wealth and how does that get shared, for example, like we saw with Philips. How do you not just sell a product to make a profit, but how do you engender entrepreneurial employability among the people of the villages, so that they can actually afford to buy it, first of all, but also because they become independent. So that's more of a holistic thinking that you go through. The final one is the spiritual based. This we started seeing on the rise in the 1990s. We started getting authors like Autry from Meredith Publishing and some others, who started talking about a spiritual basis for business and for work. And talk about, we are here not just to uplift us in our relationship with the creation, but how do we uplift everyone in their relationship with Creator? So there was a shift from horizontal to vertical, if you will. One of the things that my wife and I started in India in the year 2000, actually it's a Texas corporation, is the Global Dharma Center. We started interviewing about 3 dozen or so executives from around the world, 15 different countries, who had a spiritual view of life. And they were willing to talk to us for a couple of hours about how that grew in them, and then the stories of how that affected the way they managed their enterprises. Not as religious, but as spiritual, because they often made the distinction between the two. Some did, some didn't. But we're not talking about religion in corporation, we're talking about a sense of a vertical relationship, if you will, not just a horizontal. And some remarkable stories came out of that, about the naturalness of ethical behavior and so on. This is a movement that you're starting to see more and more PhDs coming out of business schools with a focus on spirituality. There is even, it's lovely, in the Academy of Management, which is the Association of Business School Professors. There's been for the last 10 years a special interest group on, let's see, Barbara, maybe you can remember, I don't know if, how many, it's religion, management, and spirituality or something, or, okay.
Yeah. Any example in that area? Can you pop up something spiritual based?
Yes, yes. Service Master, Fortune 500 company. They do everything from home services for gardening to cleaning. It's a huge company. They have 4 principles. The first is, and this is on their website, the first is to honor God in all we do, which means that we have to be truthful, we have to have integrity, we have to have character. Second, we have to be good citizens. The third is we have to make a good profit, so on. So the Methodist healthcare system down in Houston, they talk about not just a view of business, but what's the view of life? What's the nature of life even before we have a mission to the business? And for them, the nature of life is that we are all beings at a spiritual level and all worthy of that respect, whether we're employees, patients, doctors, or whoever. How do we as an organization foster that kind of respect in the midst of being a primary healthcare service? Those are some examples. There's more.
Tata's don't do fall in that.
Pardon?
Indian Tata's,
Yes, the Tatas,
they fall in that category.
we've talked to 2 of the executives at Tata. As individuals, they may or may not see themselves as spiritual religious, but certainly they have drawn inspiration from their spiritual heritage to become known as the highest integrity firm in India. They're always held in high esteem for their integrity. And like with J.J. Irani, that I told, that's a very typical conversation we would have with people from Tata that we know. Now, as in any organization, you're going to have other people. You know, so it's a broad classification. So one of the questions about where are you coming from is where are you playing? Which paradigm is the one that you're operating from? Now, a lot of what we see in the world today is that all 4 of these are currently operating. This is about where we are today. This is my own interpretation of my experience. This is not any broad statistical study. But that early on, the rationalist model was certainly 90% or more of the mind share of business owners. When the humanistic started rising, of course the mind share started getting split. In about 1970 or so, or 80, you started seeing the holistic on the rise as well. And I think at some point, we're going to see all 3 of those kind of equally shared, because the holistic is certainly the one that's moving forward, especially with the global reporting initiatives, the triple bottom line reporting, and those kind of movements that are going on. The spiritual base is still coming along, and it's more nascent, more still on the horizon. But it's still there. There's still a presence there. One of the ways this is helpful is that it clarifies some of the conversations that go on in the boardroom. And so, yes.
I think in the United States, actually companies are moving towards a rationalist model more and more, and that's causing a lot of income inequality. Basically, winner takes it all. That's the mentality. And
This, in some places, this might be growing back upwards.
right.
Yeah. But the question here for business model innovation is, I'm not gonna make a judgment of what's the best, but simply choose. Because as part of creating a culture is to have an alignment about what is the purpose of business. And what is it that we're trying to foster and how we're gonna do decisions. With Fuji Xerox clearly came out of a more holistic perspective, and that drove their business model. So it's just to become conscious and clear. Every one of my examples has this elite, consciously or unconsciously behind it. So it's become conscious.
I would argue that
Yes.
in the last, since the Enron episode, since the financial crisis, there's a renewed emphasis on ethics and governance.
Yes.
Look at the Stanford Business School. I mean, 10 years ago, they didn't have these programs. Now they have got multiple courses for the MBA students. So is Harvard. And there are talks about, spiritual leaders have been brought into corporations like Sri Ravi Shankar and others, talking about ethics.
Yes.
So I would argue that maybe Silicon Valley, we are so caught up in the VC funding and the IPO and the exit and all that, we are at the top, right? But the truth of the matter is, even here, I think the other parts are definitely growing.
That's my experience overall. In India, you have a vast difficulty with corruption. And yet, even within that, you start seeing that's starting to slip away. That the support for that level of corruption is starting to diminish, in my experience of talking to
One a
corporations.
company called Satyam,
Yes.
went exactly the opposite way of what it means.
Right. Yes. Yes.
Can you give any examples of companies which started with the spiritual based as the starting point for their business? I could understand starting from the rationalist point of view and going through the evolutionary process of going to the spiritual based thing. Are there any companies which started out maybe in the past 5 years, 10 years with having spiritual base as the starting point for their business?
It's embarrassing for me right now because I know of some and I can't get the name in my head as I'm listening to you. So let me just pause for a moment.
Could it be some
You know, one of them, I'll come back.
Spiritual leaders.
Yeah, no, I'll actually come back one that is actually
William?
represented in this room.
William, I
Yes.
think what he's talking about is like in the Futures Group, Big Bazaar kind of like integrated the spiritual based model to their business
Right.
innovation.
But no, you're asking about one that started from that point at the very beginning.
Yeah.
Okay, one that's represented in this room is a company called Compasites. Okay, started as a software incubation firm. The founder of it was a man who had been a senior partner at Ernst & Young, India, had been in charge of, his name is V.V. Ranganathan. He was in charge of the Entrepreneur of the Year award system for Ernst & Young in India. And one of the people that won at that level also won at the global level as Entrepreneur of the Year award. And the whole basis of their company is on a spiritual foundation. From the CEO to members of the board who are also here, and to operate from spiritual principles, not religious, not focusing on around a set of beliefs, but a spirit of we are here in bodies to be more than just ourselves. And we are here connected spiritually with other beings. And so when we deal with a customer, how do we recognize that? How does that influence the way we think about serving the customer, the way we think about doing our work? It becomes very practical very quickly. But that's a growing of a culture from the very, very beginning that way. I don't know if you'd like to say something more about that? Because you're on the board.
I sit on the board, so is Rajesh. So I think yours is accurate. And what it has done, and Rajesh can attest to it, is a tremendous sense of belonging and the loyalty, and that reflects in productivity.
Yes.
that reflects a few major things, productivity and talent and innovation, all that stuff follows with that common thread, and we have seen that over the years. So clearly that's a good example. I wouldn't have thought of it, but
Yeah.
Anyway,
Just a second, 1 second. Rajesh, do you want to add anything?
Yeah.
He's also involved with composites.
Yeah, definitely. It is something I think throughout the journey, it's been several years in composites. There were times there were up and down in terms of profitability, but the family belonging and then the teamwork, none of them were shaken, irrespective of what was happening in the outside world.
Let me reflect that in a different way. When my wife Deborah and I met, and we felt that our path was to get married, we reflected on what we had learned, first of all, from our Western Christian culture, which is also reflected in many other cultures as well. And that is that the process of marriage is that the two shall become one. Isn't that a familiar phrase? Okay. Now we said, from our life experience, the two separate beings trying to become one can be very fragile. You start trying to create that oneness experience out of, well, we have the same politics, we have the same religion, we like the same food, we go to the same movies. We try to create experiences of oneness. But as soon as some of that starts to fall apart, what's the container that holds us? And we said, in India, when you go back to the Upanishads,